China is a huge polity. It's got a vast population. And to govern such a big country, you can't just depend on laws and regulations. You need symbols. So the governors of China have always required the management and manipulation of public symbols. So this idea of rituals involving thousands of people, and sometimes across the length and breadth of a vast country, is a necessary part of governing China. This is Confucianist philosophy. And perhaps nothing more symbolically important than the recent summits in China, where you had Xi Jinping, Putin, and Modi holding hands. And in Beijing, where Xi Jinping marched out with Putin on one side and Kim Jong-un on the other. And further on, Tokayev and Prabowo. Why Tokayev and Prabowo? The Chinese are prepared for us to be friendly to the Americans, provided we don't gang up the Americans against China. But the Americans want us to gang up with them against China, often. And that makes us uncomfortable. How do we make sense of the world today? We are not in the business of crystal ball gazing, but we know where the world is today. And 10 years from now, we have a sense of what the world will be like 10 years from now. In between, it's impossible to predict what will happen precisely, because if you could, you'd be very wealthy. But you have a sense of the direction. So what will the world be like, say, 10 years from now? Well, for sure it'll be a multipolar world. Will the trial of strength between the US and China end by then? I doubt it. Would there be a peace agreement on Ukraine where Europeans and Russians are happy with the outcome? I doubt it. Will there be an equilibrium in the Middle East where Israelis and Palestinians walk with linked arms to the rising sun? I doubt it. Will America continue to dominate the world the way it did in the past? I doubt it. It will be a multipolar world. Of that, we can be sure. And perhaps nothing more symbolically important than the recent summits in China, where you had Xi Jinping, Putin, and Modi holding hands. And in Beijing, where Xi Jinping marched out with Putin on one side and Kim Jong-un on the other. And further on, Tokayev and Prabowo. Why Tokayev and Prabowo? Because in 2013, when Xi Jinping announced a Belt and Road Initiative, he did it first in Astana, end of August, and then more than a month later in Jakarta. China has an old statecraft, and for them, symbolisms are very important. The parade is to awe people, right? Because the marching was perfect. It was ridiculously perfect. I was a soldier before. I had to command parades. I thought, wow, how did they do that? You can practice every day and you may still not achieve that. But somehow they were able to do it. In the Pentagon, you might have read the report, that the orders for pizza from Papa Joe and Dominic shot up 4 times because they're all watching carefully who were there and what were the new weapon systems being displayed. Why did China invest so much time and effort? Is it to intimidate the world? I think for sure Trump was an important audience for them. Because what they don't want is for the Americans to miscalculate and trigger off a war with China. They have to show some cards so that Americans would hold back. They were hoping that India would be on their side against China. But I remember meeting Jai Shankar, the foreign minister in Abu Dhabi. I asked him, will India buy the S-400? I said, the US will sanction you. He said, who buy the S-400? And if they want, let them sanction us. I had no doubts that India will calculate in its own self-interest. Perhaps there was a time when they thought, yeah, they could make use of the US against China. Then when the Ukraine war happened, the US expected India to repudiate Russia. India would never do that because Russia was a strategic partner for decades. And when after Pahalgam, they had this air war with Pakistan, where India was bloodied, and India wanted the US to support them against Pakistan. The US would not do it. Instead, Trump invited the armed forces chief to the White House for lunch, and he promised to nominate Trump for the Nobel Prize. India, it's an adult relationship between India and the US. And when Modi went to Tianjin for the SCO meeting, it was partly to signal to the Americans, we will calculate in our own self-interest. China has been very careful to keep its relationship with India as much on an even keel as possible, because it is not in China's interest to have the rest of the world gang up against it. In a sense, it's been fortunate because the Ukraine war, the Middle East, these are distant conflicts. So the Chinese approach is don't get too involved. Don't be a troublemaker, be a peacemaker. But it's not a bad thing for American and Western attention to be diverted away from China. I think Europe is in a very difficult situation because European leaders were charging ahead with the US up front. And suddenly the US turned around and said, I'll be mediator. And they were still charging. And they're still charging today. And Americans have decided that, hey, you should make peace with Russia. I think this leadership crisis in Europe will continue for a period of time. But at the end of it, Europe must find its own center of gravity and act in its own self-interest. It will always have a strong relationship with America for historical and civilizational reasons. But Europe has its own interests vis-a-vis Russia, in the Middle East, and in Africa. To me, what is most worrying for Europe is high energy prices. Because energy efficiency and availability undergirds all economic activities. In fact, it undergirds all biological life and is a key driver of evolution. If you have excess energy, whether because you can eat more, you can eat somebody else to acquire energy from that person or animal, then you can reproduce and you can defend yourself. And once you move into AI, the limiting factor will be energy, because all coding requires energy to reverse entropy. And if you have high energy prices, you'll be in trouble sooner or later. I mean, Libya was going to be a major provider of energy to Europe. It's got enormous oil and gas resources. I always suspected that Americans did not want that. The Chinese were major investors in Libya. Today, Libya is a basket case. Russia supplied cheap energy to Europe. Well, today, that's past. America is now a supplier of energy to Europe, and Europe pays a premium for it. I don't believe this will continue for too long because European industry is being undermined. So if we look further ahead, Europe cannot depend upon Trump striking a deal with Putin. And even if Xi Jinping were cooperative, there will be no deal because in the end the deal must be between Europe and Russia. And it has to be based upon a knowledge of history. Because Russia is not going to disappear, Poland is not going to disappear, the Baltic states, the Balkans will always be uneasily at the junction of where major tectonic plates meet. So if we cast our minds ahead, the world will be multipolar. It will not be a stable equilibrium, it will be a dynamic equilibrium. Some of you might have read the famous Chinese science fiction, The Three-Body Problem. That if there are three suns circulating around each other, the mathematics is almost impossible to solve. And if you're a planet in that system, your days and nights are completely unpredictable. And that is at the heart of the science fiction. In a multipolar world, there will be many suns or big planets circulating one against the other. So the dynamics will be complicated. What is worrying today is almost a refusal to understand each other. I'm very sensitive now when I'm in Europe. I mean, in East Asian circles, Singapore is S, Russia is R. So we're permanent neighbors. So I've seen Putin many times, I've seen Lavrov many times. I count Lavrov as a friend. But when I come to Europe, I'm very careful not to say that because my European friends may get angry with me. But why should they be angry with me? If you want a solution, your approach should be, you know Lavrov? Tell me about him. What animates him? What are his fears and concerns? Knowledge. I attended a peace forum in Tsinghua University. I did not see a single senior American. I asked my Chinese host. I said, did you not invite them? He said, we did, but they wouldn't come because they were afraid of being criticized at home. Can you imagine that? How can you seek a solution if your starting point is, I do not want to talk to the other side? And if you will not talk to the other side, you will begin to demonize the other side. And then you will think of harming that other side. You demonize, you dehumanize, you work yourself into a lose-lose outcome. Whereas if we understand one another and almost be curious about the differences that separate us, that make each of us unique, then the possibilities for collaboration, for win-win outcomes becomes much greater. Thank you.
Thank you. Tell me this, how do, let's say, in this case, Singaporeans, but I would say Southeast Asians in general, how do you view Europe and Europeans?
Except for Thailand, all of Southeast Asia was colonized by European powers. And their imprint remains profound, whether it's in Indonesia or Indochina or Singapore, Malaysia. But Europe today is no longer a major power in the region. There are historical memories. They are not all negative. Because when the Japanese came to Southeast Asia during the war, they were so rough and brutal that local people, looking back to an earlier period of colonial rule, felt that Western colonial rule was much better than being under Japanese occupation. But the metropolitan powers arranged for people friendly to them to take over power. So Lee Kuan Yew, for instance, was supported by the British. But in some countries, there was revolution. In Indonesia, in Vietnam. So they had to fight bitter wars to achieve their independence. So their view of European powers are still colored by that. But on the whole, when they look at the world now, what concerns them most is the battle royale between the US and China. That concerns them the most. The China account is growing for everybody because China is now the biggest trading partner of every country in Southeast Asia. And people do not want China to have too much influence over them, so they seek diversification. They will want the Americans to be around. But the Americans often arm twist you to choose between them and China. And that's very unpleasant because we don't want to choose. We want to be friendly to both. The Chinese are prepared for us to be friendly to the Americans, provided we don't gang up the Americans against China. But the Americans want us to gang up with them against China, often. And that makes us uncomfortable. I tell my American friends, if you don't take that position, if you don't force a choice, then you will be welcome everywhere. Every door, every window will be open to you. But if you force a choice, you may not like the answer. But to create more room for maneuver, we want Europe, Japan, India, Australia to be present in Southeast Asia.
So tell me, we during some of our discussions in the last 2 days with people, we've noticed that several people were asking what's your take on the military parade that you already mentioned in Beijing. How should we in Europe that are now experiencing war on the continent, and which came as a surprise to many, how should we think about this prospect of potential war in Southeast Asia and the question of Taiwan? What's Singaporean view on that?
China is a huge polity. It's got a vast population. And to govern such a big country, you can't just depend on laws and regulations. You need symbols. So the governors of China have always required the management and manipulation of public symbols. So this idea of rituals involving thousands of people, and sometimes across the length and breadth of a vast country, is a necessary part of governing China. This is Confucianist philosophy. If a group of Chinese take a group photograph, they know where to stand. If you are not senior, you stand on the side. You avoid the chairs. It's for senior people. And among the senior people, they've already done a mental ranking of who is the most senior. So when they exchange cards, for many in the West, it's just, it's just the information. But for the Chinese, when they exchange cards, they are doing a mental ranking of who are in the room, who are senior, who are less senior. And it affects protocol. So the idea of protocol, Li, in organizing Chinese society is very important. So when you watch a big parade in Tiananmen, it is all protocol. It is to establish a system of governance and infuse the people with a sense of pride. Then there's a foreign audience. And they need to awe their neighbors, so the neighbors will be well behaved towards China, in their view. And the Americans and the Western powers, so that they will not embark on misadventures. You see? But it's not easy if you're not from that world to understand the full meaning of that parade. I attended the same parade 10 years ago. It was not that much different from the last parade. But being ethnic Chinese, I kind of have a sense of how it's done, To be invited is, of course, already a high honor. Then, where do you sit? Well, that's your place in the pantheon. What time do you have to wake up to be cleared by security? What time do you have to arrive? All that is part of an elaborate protocol. And very often when you attend an event in China, they will not tell you where you sit or stand till the last moment. Because somebody may fall sick, somebody may be absent, an additional guest may come. And like a game of Chinese checkers, suddenly everything has got to be rearranged. Then a few hours before they tell you, oh, please stand on the second row on the left-hand side, third place from the corner or something. They will give you precise instructions. So when the photograph is taken, everything's in the right place, and everybody looking at the picture will scrutinize it carefully. Who's standing next to whom? Okay, this is a pecking order. This is Confucius. And it's upon this that an empire has been governed for many centuries.
Okay, and what about the direct potential prospect of actual war with Taiwan? How, that's a topic that in Europe you don't often hear discussions about Southeast Asia, or almost at all, but if it comes up, this comes up. And people sort of take it almost as I wouldn't say for granted, in a sense that it will happen, but they take it for granted there's not that much deep discussion about it. So tell us, as a small country in Southeast Asia, Singapore, how do you look at the potential of another small country?
Kissinger has often said that in his negotiations with Zhou Enlai and with Mao Zedong, they always come back to Taiwan. So in the end, the breakthrough in relations was when the US recognized one China. It was fudged initially when Kissinger very cleverly came up with this phrase that Chinese on both sides of the straits recognize only one China. In 1979, when Carter established diplomatic relations with China, that one China is represented by Beijing. In fact, the idea of one China was first proclaimed in Cairo during the war, when Chiang Kai-shek attended together with Roosevelt and Churchill. And this was confirmed in Potsdam. So the legality of China's claim over Taiwan is internationally recognized. It's not in doubt. No one questions it. But America would, of course, want China to be divided forever if possible. But that's not going to happen because the correlation of forces is shifting. The Indo-Pacific Command, headquartered in Honolulu, they've done many exercises. In the Western Pacific, the US depends on the aircraft carriers for the projection of power. Today, Chinese hypersonic missiles, every one of those aircraft carriers are at risk. And Peter Hegseth, the defense secretary, before he became defense secretary, talked about it. So they had to be far away. But even Guam is within striking range. So the Americans will have to use cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. But China has many more of those missiles, or potentially can produce many more of those missiles. A nuclear exchange is too dangerous because China has enough warheads to effectively destroy American cities. Furthermore, if there's war over Taiwan, TSMC will be destroyed. If TSMC is destroyed, America will be deprived of its chips, Europe will be deprived of its chips. But China can carry on, maybe at 70-80%. But China has quite a formidable chip-making capability, which is improving by the month. And China now has played its most important trump card, which is rare earths, to which the US has no response. Because without the magnets, you can't build F-35s, you can't have your bunker buster bombs. You have no defense industry. And the Chinese do not want to overplay that card, so they keep the US on the short leash, where they supply every 6 months with end-user certificates. The US keeps China on the short leash on chip technology. So each has leashed the other. So I don't think there'll be war over Taiwan.
以上视频是新加坡前外交部长杨荣文先生近日在卢森堡商学院所做的一期访谈的节选。整个访谈时间有1个半小时左右。杨荣文通过分析中美竞争、俄乌战争、巴以冲突等各个热点问题，阐述了全球权力格局的重大转变，解读了当下世界地缘政治发展的趋势和长远愿景，并回答了现场观众的提问。原视频链接我放在视频简介里了，需要的请自取。杨荣文先生精通中国文化，能说流利的中文，对中华文明有着深刻的理解和真诚的欣赏。在新加坡政府任职期间，包括现在退休以后，都是一个能够与中国进行深度有效沟通的桥梁搭建者。有些人说杨荣文表面看着清华，但骨子里其实是亲美的。我认为这种说法过于简单化，用清华或亲美这样的二元对立标签去贴在一个新加坡政客身上，本身就是不准确的。要理解杨荣文乃至整个新加坡的外交行为，我们首先要明白一个核心前提：新加坡的外交政策根本的出发点和落脚点始终是其国家利益。在中美关系的定位上，杨荣文展现出的是战略性的平衡思维。他从不讳言美国在亚太地区存在着稳定性作用，因为新加坡的繁荣确实与美国主导的全球贸易和航运安全体系息息相关。但同时，他也是最早最清晰地预见到中国崛起不可阻挡的亚洲政治家之一。他多次强调，亚洲国家不应被迫在中美之间二选一，而应努力构建一个能够容纳中美两大国的区域性架构。他主张东盟应保持中心地位，在大国博弈中维持团结和战略自主。这种观点看似不偏不倚，但实际上是对中国和平发展权利的认可，以及对美国试图组建反华联盟的某种抵制。在美国对华强硬派看来，这种不选边本身就是一种对中国的倾斜。最重要的是，在台湾问题上，杨荣文的立场始终非常清晰且符合中国的核心利益。新加坡长期坚持一个中国政策，杨荣文在任时多次在公开场合重申这一立场。他深刻理解台湾问题对于中国的极端重要性，明白这是中美关系中最敏感、最核心的问题，也是中国绝对不可逾越的红线。他认为触碰这条红线意味着与中国的全面交恶，这完全不符合新加坡的国家利益。所以说杨荣文骨子里亲美，是忽视了他在诸多关键问题上对中国的理解、尊重乃至战略上的支持。他的行为逻辑是一贯的、透明的，即在坚定维护一个中国原则这一根本前提下，与中美双方都发展最广泛、最深入的合作关系，以此确保新加坡的安全与繁荣。那么对于我们而言，应该如何看待像新加坡这样的所谓小国，以及像杨荣文这样的政治家呢？我认为，只要是能坚定支持一个中国就很好，就可以当朋友。